Hey everyone. So today we are going to be looking at photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is this extremely important process that is done by plants as well as some bacteria and algae, and it is critical to life. So what's happening is that in this process, our plants, and we're going to focus on our plants, are taking carbon dioxide and water plus energy from the sun or photons, right? You can think of photons as little packets of light energy. And using all of this in this process, they are fixing carbon. So essentially what that means is they are taking carbon from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, and they are fixing it into and turning it into an organic molecule. And that organic molecule is called glucose, C6H12O6. And this process also produces oxygen as a byproduct, right? So if we look at this, we see these two things that are critical for life, at least life as we know it on Earth, right? Oxygen and glucose. And as we're going to see later in the following lectures, when we look at cellular respiration, this glucose is the basis of cell metabolism. When we go over cellular respiration, our organisms are breaking down this glucose molecule, and they are using the energy from that to create ATP. And ATP is the energy currency of the cell, and we'll get into it in a little bit, but it's essentially the molecule that is going to power all cellular activities. Right? So we're creating, in this process of photosynthesis, we're creating that food that is then going to power everything, power all organisms, as well as oxygen. And if we want to be correct with this balance our terms here, really what's happening is we are using 6 CO2 and 6 water molecules, plus our photons, to create one glucose molecule plus oxygen. Oh, sorry, 6 oxygen. Right, so that's the more balanced equation, and you've probably learned about balancing equations in chemistry. Right, so really what we're doing is we are taking carbon dioxide and water and light energy, and we are making food and oxygen. Now, we can break down this process, and we're going to go through this process in a little more depth. But it can really be broken down into two reactions. The light reaction and the dark reaction. And now, the hard part about talking and writing is sometimes you just start writing random things. There we go. Dark reaction. Now, dark reaction is actually not the best name because this is called light reaction because it requires those photons, that light energy. Dark reaction doesn't. But this also occurs during daylight. So dark reaction is a little bit of a poor name. So it's also referred to as the light independent reaction or the Kelvin cycle. Right? 3 names for it. Say again, spelling is not my thing today. Or the Kelvin cycle. Right, so 3 names for it. I'll probably interchange them as I go through this, but just for you guys to be aware. So this process up here, photosynthesis, can be subdivided into these 2 different reactions. And we're going to look at each reaction a little more in depth. But right here, I want to provide an overview because I think it'll help you as we later kind of go into this a little deeper. Right? So in our light reaction, what's happening is H2O and photons right? Those packets of light energy, the energy from the sun, are being used to create ATP, NADPH, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit, and oxygen. Right, so this is a light reaction. Water and the sun's energy are being used through this process that we're going to look at. It's an electron transport chain to create ATP. And again, ATP is that energy currency of the cell. NADPH is a molecule that is going to act to provide energy similarly to ATP. It also accepts the electron at the end of this electron transport chain, and I'll show you how that works. So we're creating these two molecules that provide energy. And then we're also creating this oxygen as a byproduct. And this is the byproduct. Gets released to the atmosphere. Product. And now this ATP and NADPH, they go and they are going to help power the dark reaction or this light independent reaction or Kelvin cycle. Right? And it's with that, we then have, in this Kelvin cycle, carbon dioxide is fixed, and this is, again, through the use of ATP and NADPH, to create that glucose molecule. Right, so if we're looking at this from a kind of overview standpoint, right, we're staring at this from out, we see that this process of photosynthesis, we are taking carbon dioxide, water, and energy from the sun, and we are using that to create a glucose molecule and oxygen. And this process can be broken down into two reactions, the light reaction and the Kelvin cycle, or light independent reaction or dark reaction. In the light reaction, we have water and those photons, that's sun's energy, are being used to create ATP and NADPH, two molecules that help power cellular processes, ATP being the kind of more numerous one. And oxygen is also created as part of this light reaction, and that is, the byproduct that then gets released to the atmosphere and allows us to breathe. And this ATP and NADPH that is created in this light reaction is then used in the dark reaction. And in the dark reaction, or the Kelvin cycle, we're actually taking carbon dioxide and fixing it, or taking it from being a gas and fixing it into an organic molecule, and we're creating this glucose molecule, C6H12O6. Right? So that is the overview of photosynthesis. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look a little more in depth into each one of these reactions, right? So we'll start with the light reaction, and then we'll move into the Kelvin cycle. So let me pull up a new page. And here we are going to focus on the light reaction. And again, what's happening here is I'm going to write it up here as a reference. During this, water and sun's energy, photons, are being used to create ATP plus NADPH plus oxygen. All right, that's what's happening in this light reaction. So in order to understand exactly what's going on, we need to look back at our plant cell anatomy. So if you recall, we're going to draw a little plant cell right here. There's our plant cell, that's the cell wall, and we had our different organelles, those little organs, right? The central vacuole, we'll say that's the nucleus. We had a endoplasmic reticulum, looks something like that. Well, within our plant cell, there are those organelles that we refer to as chloroplasts, right? And those chloroplasts were very important. Chloroplasts, because they are the organelles in which photosynthesis takes place, right? That's what we learned. So we're going to look now and see how that process occurs. So we're going to zoom in here on one of our chloroplasts. And if we look in, here's our chloroplast right here. If you looked in your chloroplast, you will see these little pancake structures, right? And they're kind of stacked on top of each other like a stack of pancakes. Well, those are called thylakoids, right? That is a thylakoid. And this stack of thylakoids is called a grana. Now, within our cytoplasm, there's this outer membrane, right? And there are thylakoids, and there's a membrane that surrounds each thylakoid. And then these thylakoids are sitting in a fluid that is called the stroma. And there is a fluid within each thylakoid that is called the lumen, right? So we have our chloroplast here, and within our chloroplast, there's this fluid called the stroma. There are these little pancake structures within the chloroplast that are called thylakoids. The whole group of them is called a grana. And within our thylakoids, there is more fluid, and that is called the lumen. Okay, now we are going to zoom in further, because this process, which I'll write it up here, ultimately is referred to as photosynthesis. This process of this light reaction, is going to take place at the thylakoid membrane. So again, right here, here's our thylakoid. Here's its membrane right here. We are going to zoom in again. Right? And so we will have a membrane that looks like this. Right? So we're zoomed in. Here's the membrane. And in fact, this is a lipid bilayer. So those lipids are fats, and there's two of them. Kind of looks something like that, and that runs all across. So this is our thylakoid membrane, and I'll write it over here. Thylakoid membrane. And up here is the stroma, right? That's the liquid in our chloroplasts. And here, this is the interior of our thylakoid, and that has the liquid that we refer to as the lumen. All right. Now, embedded within the thylakoid membrane are things called photosystems. And these photosystems are these complex systems that consist of different molecules and proteins, and they work in this process, in this light reaction. So we have a photosystem 2 that's actually first in this chain that we're going to see. So we'll put PS2 there, and that refers to photosystem 2. And then a little bit further along in the membrane, we have photosystem 1. Right, and again, there are different molecules, chlorophyll, some other molecules that I'll show in a second, that exist in these photosystems. Now, what is happening in the light reaction is that photons from the sun are coming down and they are exciting electrons in the chlorophyll in photosystem 2. Remember, chlorophyll is that green pigment. It is responsible, very important for photosynthesis. This is why. Right, so it is within photosystem 2 here. There's also one in photosystem 1. And the photons, the sun energy, is exciting the electrons in photosystem 2. And what happens is those electrons get excited, and then they start to get passed down a chain of all these other molecules. So it goes from chlorophyll to a molecule called, I actually have to look it up, phytophytin, and then another molecule, and then another molecule, and I'm going to show this in a second. But as it gets passed along these molecules, each time it goes from a different molecule, it releases energy. And in that process, hydrogen protons that exist in the stroma get pumped using that energy into the lumen. Right? So photons are shining down on our photosystem. It is exciting the electrons in the chlorophyll. That electron then bounces over to this other molecule, phytophytin. When it bounces over, that creates energy, and that energy pumps one of these hydrogen protons into the lumen. Right? So this electron bounces from molecule to molecule through photosystem 2. Once it gets to photosystem 1, there's chlorophyll in there too, and there's some extra photon energy that bumps it up again, and it bounces along, and each time it is bouncing from molecule to molecule, these hydrogen protons are getting pumped into the lumen, right? So we start to have a buildup in the lumen of these hydrogen protons. Now there is another structure embedded in the thylakoid membrane, and that is, excuse my poor drawing, that is referred to as ATP synthase. Right? Now, this ATP synthase kind of acts like a motor. Right? So you have all this buildup of these hydrogen protons in the lumen, and eventually they want to make their way back out of this lumen into the stroma. Think of like that osmosis where you're going from a high concentration, and you want to even it out to an area of lower concentration. That's what's happening here, right? It's chemiosmosis. So you have a high concentration buildup in this lumen, and these hydrogen protons want to make their way back out into the stroma. Well, they're able to do that through this ATP synthase molecule, right? But as they make their way through this ATP synthase, there is like a cylinder within here, and it turns that cylinder. And as it turns that cylinder, it pushes together an ADP molecule and an extra phosphate. And when you combine these, when they get pushed together, they make ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Right? So this, if we're looking at an ATP, it is an adenosine molecule, and 3 phosphate molecules. Right? And it's this last phosphate molecule that typically will break off, and when it breaks off, that releases energy, and that's the energy that our cells in general use to power different cellular activities, right? So when this breaks off, it releases energy and it forms ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Well, if we want to create ATP, we need to latch this phosphate group back on, and it is occurring through this light reaction. Right? These hydrogen protons get pumped through. When they make their way back out through this ATP synthase, it turns this cylinder, and it's essentially just smashing together ADP with phosphate groups to create ATP. All right, so that's the basis. Now, where does water play in all of this? Well, as we said in the beginning here, when these photons excite that electron in chlorophyll, that electron leaves and it bounces along this electron transport chain. Well, eventually, at the end of this process, that electron is going to combine with NADP+, and it combines with an electron to create NADPH. Right? That's creating that NADPH up there, right? This is an electron acceptor, and it accepts this electron at the end of this process. And I'll show you that process in a second. Well, what happens now is that electron is gone. So we need a replacement for that electron all the way back at the beginning here for that chlorophyll. And that replacement comes from water. So you have your water molecule here, and it gets broken up, right? It gets split up, and the oxygen molecules gets released, right, as that byproduct. And then the electron from these hydrogen go to replace, or the electron from this water molecule goes to replace that electron that was lost in this electron transport chain. And then these hydrogen protons just exist now as well that can be used to pump through to the lumen. Right? So that's what's happening. We have these photon light energy is exciting electrons in chlorophyll and these photosystems. That electron moves along this chain. It eventually gets accepted by this NADP to create NADPH. Through that process, it pumps hydrogen protons into the lumen from the stroma. Eventually, the buildup of these hydrogen protons, they want to make their way back out through the stroma. They can do it through this ATP synthase that is embedded in the thylakoid membrane. And as they do, they turn the cylinder in this ATP synthase, and it smashes together these ADP and phosphate groups to create ATP. So that is what's happening in this light reaction. It seems like there's a lot in play, but it's actually, when you get it down, it's not too complicated. At least this maybe more simplified version. But what I want to show you now is that electron transport chain in a little more detail. Right? So I mentioned that there is, well, let me just draw that. And I'll say this is a version of an electron transport chain. There's also an important electron transport chain in cellular respiration that we're going to look at too. But I said that in photosystem 2, right, we had chlorophyll. I believe it's chlorophyll A, actually. But I'm not positive. Right, and that's in photosystem 2. And then we had other molecules in that photosystem. Phytin. Checking on that spelling. There's one. There's one plastoquinin. I have to look that up. There's essentially, you don't need to know these because honestly I don't remember them unless I look them up. But essentially, phytophytin is the one right after chlorophyll. There's a couple other molecules. We then get into another type of chlorophyll. And this one is found in that photosystem 1. Right, and then eventually we bounce along. And way at the end here, is our NADP+. Right, so here's our electron transport chain. And again, what is happening is that we have our photons that are coming in. And we have our electron right here in chlorophyll A. Here's our little electron in this molecule. And those photons come in and it excites that electron, right? And now it's up here. And then, so it has a lot of energy. And then that electron is going to move to phytophytin, right? But as it moves, it releases some energy, right? So some energy gets released. And again, in that process of energy getting released, it pumps these hydrogen protons. It uses that energy to pump it from the stroma into the loop, right? So this electron is going to bounce from molecule to molecule, and each time it bounces, it's releasing more energy. It eventually gets into another chlorophyll here in photosystem 1, and it gets a little bit more energy, and then along it's going to continue to bounce along all the way until it gets to NADP+, and at NADP+, it combines with it to create NADPH. Right? But that electron is now lost. It bounced along this entire chain, and now it's stuck in this NADPH. We're going to need to replace this electron that was lost, and it gets replaced from the breakup of water. Right? This gets broken up. One of the electrons goes here, and it replaces, it'll actually be down here by now, it replaces that lost electron. And then these hydrogen protons can then be used again by the plant to be pumped into, or can sit in the stroma and eventually be pumped in the lumen through this process again. So the end result of this electron transport chain is the production of this NADPH, as well as the production of all that ATP as these hydrogen protons that got built up in the lumen make their way back out through that ATP synthase. And it creates all of those ATP, right? It combines the ADP with a phosphate group to create ATP. Right, so at the end of this, we have NADPH, we have ATP, and then we have all this oxygen that is the byproduct from the splitting up of this water. Right, and we have O2 as our three main products. So that is the light reaction. And what's going to happen now is this NADPH and this ATP are going to go take part in the Kelvin cycle, where we're actually going to take carbon dioxide and turn it into glucose. So let's look at that now. Did I use all these? Oh, here we go. Okay, so here we are now going to look at the Kelvin cycle. And again, you can also talk about this as the dark reaction or the light independent reaction. And here what is happening is carbon dioxide plus the ATP and NADPH that was created in the light reaction are going to be used to create a glucose molecule. Right? And this is going to be a simplified Kelvin cycle. We're not going to go too in depth with it. But essentially what's happening is we're starting with carbon dioxide, right? And carbon dioxide reacts with a molecule called ribulose bisphosphate. So that is the first step in this cycle. We have carbon dioxide, and it's going to react with ribulose bisphosphate or ribulose 1,5 bisphosphate. I'll call it, you may hear it called RuBP or RuBP. And it is technically ribulose 1,5 bisphosphate. And when we're looking at the Kelvin cycle, it's a good way to help keep track of what's going on is to keep track of the carbons, right? Because really what's happening is here is we're fixing carbon. We're taking it from carbon dioxide and we're creating an organic molecule. So by keeping track of the carbons, it kind of can help us understand what's going on. So we have one carbon here. This is a one carbon molecule. And in fact, what's happening is we're taking 6 of these, right? So it's a 1 carbon molecule, and this ribulose bisphosphate is a 5 carbon molecule. And there are 6 of them, right, in total. So 6 ribulose bisphosphates are going to combine with 6 carbon dioxides, and they are going to create Pgal, 12 Pgal, or phosphoglyceraldehyde. Sometimes you will hear this as also called G3P, right? But 2 names for the same thing, Pgal. Now, there's actually some intermediary compounds that get formed between here, but we're not going to talk about them yet. We will bring up one at a later lecture. But for right now, what I want you guys to know is that at the start of this Kelvin cycle, we have 6 carbon dioxides and they react with 6 of this RuBP to create 12 PGALs. And these PGALs are 3 carbon molecules, right? So again, let's keep track of our carbons here. We had 6 1 carbon, so this is 6 carbons total. And we had 6 5 carbons, so 6 times 5 is 30. So we have 36 total carbons that are reacting with each other. And they're creating 12 3 carbon molecules. 12 times 3 is 36. So bing, all of our carbons are created or accounted for. Now for this to occur, for our carbon dioxide and our RuBP to combine, it's going to take energy, and that is where our ATP and NADPH come into play. So through this process, we're going to need 12 NADPHs and 12 ATPs, right? And they are going to provide the energy. They're going to break down into ADP plus a phosphate group and NADP plus. And through that breaking down, through the loss of the electron here and the phosphate group here, it's going to create energy. And that energy is used to combine these to make these 12 PGALs. Right? Now the next step is from these 12 PGALs, 2 of them, PGAL, 2 of them are going to be used to create 1 glucose molecule. Right? And this is our big product that we're trying to create. Right? So we have a 3 carbon, PGAL is a 3 carbon compound. We take 2 of them to create a 6 carbon compound that is glucose, right? Our end product. Now the remaining 10 go back into the Kelvin cycle here, and they go and they reform ribulose 1,5 bisphosphate, or RuBP. And again, if we have 10 of these, we're keeping track of our carbons. We have 10 of them, that gives us 30. And they go back here to create 6 ribulose bisphosphates. 6 times 5 is 30. All of our carbons are accounted for. And this cycle can just continue on and on and on and on and on. Right? And that is it. That is the Kelvin cycle. That is the second reaction in this photosynthesis process. And that is where we get our glucose molecule. So again, overview. If we're looking at this entire process, let me find my first one. Right? In this whole process of photosynthesis, we're taking carbon dioxide and water and energy from the sun, and we're creating a glucose molecule, and we're getting oxygen as the byproduct. And we have our light reaction, where we're really using that sun's energy to create this thing called ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell, as well as an NADPH. And we break down the water molecule in this process, and that oxygen gets released, and we use the electrons and the proton as part of that electron transport chain. And then we take the ATP and the NADPH that we made in the light reaction, and we use it in this Kelvin cycle to create glucose. So that's photosynthesis. In the next lecture, we are going to look at an inefficiency in the process, which we call photorespiration, and then some methods that some plants have evolved to account for that inefficiency.